We've heard from Greg, we've heard from Antony, we've heard from Laura. Also here on the stage, former Federal Police Commissioner Mick Palmer, 33 years experience. He was a barrister and was Commissioner of the Federal Police under both the Keating and Howard governments. Give a wave, Mick, just so nobody is confused. Like many of those people here, he's been recognised for his service to the community in many ways, but in particular for battling police corruption, he was given an Officer of the Order of Australia Award. He has an active interest in human rights. He's been vocal on the issue of drug law reform and has argued for a national drug summit to consider all the options, including the decriminalisation of drugs. Sitting next to Mick is Fiona Patten. I will read what I've been given, because it's probably better than if I just introduced Fiona from my own knowledge of her. Written on my sheets is as follows. She's the founder and leader of the Reason Party and a member of the Victorian Legislative Council for the Northern Metropolitan Region. Since founding the Australian Sex Party, now called the Reason Party, she's fought for drug law reform, medically supervised injecting centres, voluntary assisted dying and safe access to abortions, leading Jon Faine to call her Australia's most effective legislator. That was written. And she has been, as I'm quoted in these notes as saying, the most effective member of our Parliament. It's wonderful to have you here, Fiona. Next to Fiona is Greg Barnes. He's a practising barrister. He's the spokesman for the National Lawyers Alliance, which should not be confused with the Law Council of Australia. They deal with criminal defence and human rights issues, and they provide an alternate voice for the legal profession. He was once disendorsed as a Liberal candidate for Parliament, owing to his criticism of the Howard government's policies for asylum seekers, for which I think we should congratulate you for taking a stand. He's also been an outspoken supporter and representative for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, as well as on the issue of drug law reform, which he's argued is blighted by the irrational obsession with prohibition. And you've heard from Laura. And then Tania de Jong. Tania is a trailblazing Australian soprano. She's an entrepreneur, a creative innovation catalyst, and also relentlessly pursuing public policy solutions to a whole range of things. She created the Song Room and Potpourri. She's a great conference organiser and participant, and I say that from personal experience. And you can have a look at her TED Talk, How Singing Changes the Brain, which is done well. Could you welcome all of our panel and Tania as well? Okay, now let's get to it. Mick, if I can start with you, because the police approach to this is fascinating. Over my now far too many years behind the microphone, I have interviewed countless police commissioners, every one of whom has conceded that we can't arrest our way out of the drug problem in our community. So why don't police take a more progressive stance on dealing with the issue?
Well, I guess the police role is to enforce the law, not to make it. So although you may have some of those views as an operational police officer or a senior administrative police officer, if you have those concerns, as I did at a point in my career, your role is to take them up privately with the government. If you want to take it up publicly, you better resign before you do it, because it's not your job to make the law, it's your job to enforce it. So I understand that, and police can't be criticised really for enforcing the law of the day. If they are progressive in their attitudes or have thought more deeply about the issues in the way that I have, not to say that the way I've thought about this is necessarily correct, they will be having conversations with their own minister and sometimes with prime ministers and with cabinet or parts of cabinet and with premiers of states about what they see are the shortfalls or the deficiencies in current policy. And I think what needs to be recognised in that as well is that police do exercise a lot of discretion, despite the fact that a lot of things go wrong in drug enforcement. And we talk about, Greg mentioned the 76,000, I think it was, cannabis arrests, and I think 156,000 people arrested just for use and possession last year, which I have to say, to my mind, is bloody horrific. Why we would do that, I'm not really sure. But nevertheless, a lot of discretion is exercised. And there's a risk in exercising discretion because you can be criticised for exercising discretion that's seen by others as being too lenient. But a lot of police do exercise discretion. I've seen lots of examples of it, particularly since I retired from policing and got more publicly involved, if you like, in drug reform. And I've spoken to New South Wales Police particularly on 2 or 3 occasions and seen examples where, for example, at a drug overdose, they've arrived where everybody in the group, where one person was either dead or dying, had obviously been taking heroin, generally heroin in these situations, with no thought to arresting anybody else in the group, on the basis that if they obviously did, next time they wouldn't make the phone call. And so the focus was simply and purely on saving the life, if they could, of the person who was the victim of the overdose. A lot of that sensible sort of exercise of discretion goes unnoticed, and in fact, I think it was in Peter Ryan's day, he actually issued a guideline to that effect across New South Wales Police. So,
Drug prohibition is the flip side of police corruption. The two go hand in glove, do they not? If you didn't have prohibition, then you wouldn't have the main incentive and driver that gives us police corruption.
Well, there's certainly a connection between the enforcement of drug laws and corruption, or the potential for corruption, but I think it's quite wrong to say. I mean, there's been avenues of corruption, I think, in policing forever, and not all of corruption has been related to drug laws and drug law enforcement.
No, not all of it, but primarily, principally. Well,
it's been a major corruption cause, I would think. I think that's fair to say. I think the only answer I can give to that really is the fact that the better trained your people are, the less likely they are to be corrupted. In no profession will you find people, and I worked at the law, as you mentioned, I was a barrister for a while, I worked with people as a barrister who I knew from their own explanations to me were corrupt. They were telling me things that were illegal. They were doing things which I knew were illegal. I mean, you're not going to cut corruption out of any profession. It will be there wherever you look. But the better trained your people are, the less likely it will be to occur. And I think that's a value and advantage that Australia does have.
And just final question for you before we get everybody talking and work my way through the panel. What does policing in Australia look like in the modern era if you don't have prohibition? Because it seems it's a major consumer of police resources. And as police constantly remind us, they're always short of money and personnel. So if you took the futile pursuit of drugs out of the equation, what would policing look like?
I think there will never be enough police to go around. I think street policing has become more difficult than it's ever been before, more unpredictable, more dangerous for young police officers, men and women on the street, than it's ever been. So I think it won't matter. I mean, there's this fear, I know, and there's this huge investment, as Antony well knows, in the United States, trillions of dollars of investment in drug law enforcement and the DEA as a drug enforcement administration, that would almost disappear if you legalise drugs, of course. I don't think in the Australian context it would save too many resources. You'd change your focus. You know, my own view is that our focus is wrong. We need to keep our focus on organised drug trafficking in the high end of the marketplace, where the damage is most severe where the danger is most severe and the damage to the people we arrest and apprehend and investigate is the least we can possibly achieve. Move our focus away from use and possession cases, change the focus of what we do. And if we have a zero tolerance in terms of law enforcement, it ought to be a zero tolerance to the unavoidable loss of human lives through overdoses and the avoidable serious injury and hospitalisation. And no other zero tolerance should matter. Otherwise, it's a bit like being more concerned about the numbers of cars on the road than you are about the numbers of fatalities.
It's an interesting analogy. Fiona, Patten, how do we overcome inertia in parliamentary politics? Because it seems as much as anything, nobody wants to deviate from what's regarded as acceptable.
I think you're right, and it's very much around safe. And I've been around politics for a very long time, and getting politicians to change is very difficult. They feel that if they keep doing the same thing over and over again, they will be re-elected over and over again. And at the minute that they divert from that, they risk re-election. And they're worried. And it's not about the 80% that support drug law reform, support the decriminalisation of drugs. It's the 4% that don't. And that 4% is the 4% that they believe will change their vote for this. I want to pick up something that Mick just said. I find this tussle between police and politicians frustrating. I get told by police, well, we just follow the law, we don't make the law. But when I try and change the law, the politicians say, yeah, but the police won't like that. And sure enough, they don't quite often. And I, even just this week, we're debating a bill around hemp and the plantations of hemp. And they're introducing these ridiculous licensing that if your son got done for possession of cannabis and was prosecuted, you can't have a hemp license to grow a fibre to make concrete. And they said, oh, well, the police wanted that. And so while they say police aren't involved in our policy, they are. And we saw this with the Supervised Injecting Centre as well, that until we could get the support of the Police Association, we had no chance of getting support from the Premier and from the government. So it's...
Police Association, department, or both?
I felt that it had to be both, but certainly but the police wouldn't go public with their support, but the Police Association could be public about that policy. And I would appreciate police are not public about policy, but they're certainly there in the background influencing that policy. And I hope, talking about inertia, I really hope that it doesn't require a story like Laura's coming from a politician to find change.
And what about the power of the tabloids and the shock jocks?
Yes, John, yes, yes, we do always bear in mind what the Faine show might say.
Bullshit.
It's true, John. Look, certainly, I've seen so much legislation come through that you call them, well, that's a Herald Sun bill, and it is that reaction. I actually think the public is getting onto that. I mean, apart from the fact that they're not reading the newspapers that much anymore, but the politicians are so thin-skinned and so worried about what the front page of the Herald Sun might say. And it's not so much worried about what it says, it's worried about what the opposition will say about what it says. And in many ways, I sometimes muse over the idea of what if the opposition wasn't the opposition, it was just not the government. And if we didn't have this sort of oppositional approach to politics, where we had non-government and government, and at the moment in my chamber, there's 22 of us who are not government and 18 who are government, but 11 of that 22 call themselves the opposition. The other 11 of us call ourselves the not very cross bench, the rather happy bench, the non-government, the people that are not there to oppose, but there to make change. And, maybe we should be thinking that way.
All right, I'll come back to you, as I'm sure everyone on the panel wants to have a go at some of these questions, but let me keep involving some of you who haven't yet spoken. Greg, I'm concerned about the hypocrisy and double standards that we see all the time, particularly amongst the judiciary and the legal profession. And you know, as well as I do, that there are people who are pompously making pronouncements, not just from the bar table, but sometimes from the bench, whilst in their own private lives, they're doing the exact opposite of what they're publicly pronouncing. How do we cut through on that?
Well, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that, in fact, somebody you and I were talking about before we came on once famously said he thought there was a lot of cocaine at the bar, and they went after him. And in fact, I defended him for once in his life. We won't name Peter Farris, but I do think it's an issue. But let me give you this story. I practice in Tasmania as well as here in Victoria. A very senior judge in Tasmania said to me once, Greg, every time I sentence a drug trafficker, I think to myself, I've just created a vacancy in the market. And can I tell you now that I don't know any judge or any magistrate or any lawyer who believes in the war on drugs. I've never come across them. But what I do get frustrated about is the inertia in my profession about drug law reform. The Australian Lawyers Alliance, of which I was national president, we were the first organisation in Australia to go out and support drug law reform. The Law Council says nothing about it. The Law Institute did here in Victoria, the New South Wales Bar has, but this is a serious issue that needs to be confronted, and all too often you get the excuse, oh, it's the legislators who make it, we're just here to deal with the laws as they are. And to come back to your point, John, there's also the staggering hypocrisy, which we won't go into here, but there is no doubt that drug use is very, very common amongst lawyers all around Australia. It's a very stressful profession. Why wouldn't it be?
But I guess it has an impact. Well, that has an impact when they do their job. It has an impact on the rest of society.
Yeah.
And this whole double standard that people pretend that they're one thing when in fact they're another is part of the charade, part of the nonsense that's going on, which stops us getting to grips with the full extent of the problem.
Well, look, again, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And when I see judgments of the Court of Appeal that talk about the evils of drugs, and they talk about the need for harsh sentences. For example, Commonwealth offences now, if you bring drugs into Australia, you go to jail for 15 to 20 years. I mean, it's just absurd. It is a monumental failure. But let me just quickly address this point. If you look at this as a matter of public policy and you say, is the regulatory regime cost effective? Is it giving us bang for our taxpayers' buck? This would be one of the most disastrous experiments ever undertaken by governments in this country, in fact, any country in the world.
And before I go to Tania, what chances then of leadership from within the legal profession, given that the police, who are the other main participants in this, along with doctors, we don't have a representative of the medical profession, but there's been particularly Alex Wodak, who gets more than a passing mention, Antony, in your book, I noticed. Where's the leadership going to come from? Is there any chance that not just your group, which is representing an important but small part of the profession, any chance there might be leadership from the legal groups?
There has been leadership by the New South Wales Bar, John, earlier this year with a submission that Mick probably knows more about. I'm waiting to see the Victorian Bar show leadership on the issue, and I think also what it requires is some judges to make comments about the absurdity of the policy. They're happy to do it. Judges are happy to make comments in passing, in sentences or in appeals about other matters. They never do it in relation to drugs. They just keep parroting the same lines that they know are utter bullshit. And that's what's required.
All right, thank you, Greg. Now, Tania, you've just been to the States. What did you see there? Because with the legalisation in some states and some territories over there, legally selling drugs has become massive business.
Yes, and obviously the wars that Antony's talking about is a major concern in terms of the cartels. But I think what I saw in the States was an enormous appetite from people to see what is the healing potential of some of these drugs or medicines, as you may like to think of them. And that we're now seeing psilocybin and MDMA and other therapies which are achieving breakthrough therapy status with the FDA, which means that the FDA is actually helping those drugs to become legalised in therapeutic settings. And I think what I'm seeing is that we have a major mental health crisis in this country and globally. We have 1 in 5 people who are suffering with a mental health illness right now, 1 in 2 predicted to have a serious mental health illness in their lifetimes. And we need to do something about this now, and Australia is well behind.
And you have a commercial interest in this as well?
Well, not a commercial one. I have a charitable interest in this in that my husband and I have recently founded a charity called Mind Medicine Australia. And I can assure you I don't have any commercial interest in that. This is completely pro bono. But we've set that up so that Australia can actually keep up with the rest of the world in terms of legalising psychedelic medicines so that we are ready and we can provide these medicines to people who need it and who are suffering. And I can assure you that every day we receive heart-wrenching emails and letters from people. I have some on my desk right now, from people who are crying out for these medicines, who've tried every other thing, just like your sister, and whose lives will be saved if they can have access to these therapies.
And in fact, there's a bit of a battle going on between Washington State on the West Coast and Oregon, a bit like the French argue over who has the best cheese, regional by region. The Americans are now looking at a sort of appellation contrôlée, you know, a sort of labelling system where they can say, well, Oregon marijuana is much better than Washington State marijuana. We've got the best, and if it's got our stamp of approval on it, that guarantees its quality. And there's billions of dollars at stake. Billions of dollars at stake. There's publicly listed companies on the stock exchange that are trading shares, and they're turning over billions of dollars, and people have realised, in typical American capitalistic fashion, that this is an area for enormous growth. And Antony writes about it, but did you see much of that in evidence as you were travelling?
Well, so I was more attending conferences that were related to psychedelic therapies and more broadly drug policy, so I wasn't so much looking at the drug commercialisation aspects. But yeah, there's a lot of people approaching us too who want to develop businesses in Australia to commercialise some of these medicines.
And do you think it's inevitable then that the medicinal push will lead to a rethink, even the therapeutic side of things, if not just the prohibition and law enforcement side?
Yeah.
All right, I'll come back to you shortly. Antony, tell us a bit about the commercial pushes in America that you've had a look at and what effect that's having almost a U-turn on public policy.
Well, what's happened really in the last 5 years is a profound sea change in public opinion. So although many of us on this panel have been talking about these issues for decades, some more than others of course, public opinion has really led the way. So in the US, for example, in the last 5 or 10 years, particularly the last 5 years, you now have a majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, who support legalised cannabis. Yes, many states obviously have made it legal. The big business side of it is something I look at. I'm a little bit cautious about it. I'm cautious because in many states that have legalised, and these are the lessons that Australia should take if it chooses to go down this path, which it should, to legalise cannabis, that too often people who have suffered the most from the drug war, people of colour especially, can't get access to the industry. In other words, unless the state chooses to rectify the, I guess, almost crimes against the people who suffered because have a criminal conviction, you often can't open a business. And in many of these states, people of colour are often not being given licences to open cannabis businesses. So that's one side of it. And the big cannabis aspects, which are definitely alive in Australia, they exist. And I think one of the problems with the way the Liberal government here federally has implemented medicinal cannabis to make it legal is they focus too much on helping their big cannabis mates, where there are countless Australians who want to get cannabis for medicinal purposes for their kids, for themselves, whatever it might be. And often they just can't get it. You can get it illegally still, sure, but they should be able to get it legally. And to me, the vision of a legalised market, cannabis or any other drug, should not be prioritising the big companies, which to some extent might be inevitable unless there's far greater regulation. And too often in the US, the hyper-capitalist society, as you say, have not done that properly. And that to me is a concern. Many people who are involved in this industry have those equal concerns, that they worry they're going to be sort of pushed out. And what's left is like what you have principally is in the tobacco and alcohol industry, which is big players often squeezing out the small. That to me is not an ideal vision for legalised cannabis here.
When we were on the West Coast a few years ago for holidays, I thought it was poetic almost that you'd go to a shopping centre and in the mall, the marijuana shop was usually right next door to the gun shop. And you just had to wonder about that. But we talk all the time about the US, but in fact Canada's gone further down the path too. What lessons do we learn from the Canadian experience?
So Canada legalised in 2018, last year, and there's a lot of results coming in, although it's very much early days. There is obviously large commercial cannabis companies. In many of the areas of Canada, use has not gone up. In some areas it has slightly. It really varies from area to area. In the US, that's very similar. And one of the things that I think is really important, and I talk about this in the book, is that someone like me who advocates legalising cannabis and looking at Canada as a model or anywhere else, this doesn't mean that there aren't potential dangers in people who abuse cannabis. It's a real thing. You know, you can get sick or abused or addicted to cannabis. Yep. I'm not denying that. Yep. And no one who seriously advocates it does. The problem often, particularly in the moment, when the fact that it's illegal, including cannabis, is that the state does not regard these problems in a serious enough way. So to me, in a legalised system, there needs to be, drugs, in my view, should not be too easily accessible. And education is vital here, that in many of the states that have done this, and in Portugal it's decriminalised all drugs, educations, of which I might add, since 2001, all drug use of all ages has come down. Everywhere. Doesn't mean that people don't still abuse drugs. In Portugal they do. But that where money would have gone to law enforcement has often now gone to education. And as I think I said before, education to me of all drugs should start at schools at a young age. The kids should be 4, 5, young. Doesn't mean they should be encouraged to take drugs, of course. It means that you outline what drugs can do. And in Canada, I think so far, from what I can understand, the people I speak to, it's often being managed better than in many of the US states that have done so. And one thing I'd finally say is that it's encouraging that this election cycle in the US, the fact that the majority of Democratic candidates who are running, they might not win against Trump, but they might, are advocating these legalising cannabis, reparations for people suffering from the drug war so they can get engaged in the industry if they want. And finally, not unimportantly, massive state investment in those areas that have suffered the most from it. And that to me, you know, wouldn't it be nice if the Australian electoral cycle, Labor or Liberal, hello, major political parties, I mean, there's no one, correct me if I'm wrong, in the federal parliament openly saying this. The Greens, yes, and other small parties, to be sure, I'm talking about the major parties here, are not saying this. No. And I like to think with cannabis there would be more support than they think.
Well, you've given the Herald Sun its headline, 4-year-olds should be taught about drugs in schools. So there you are. That should sell a few copies of your book, if nothing else.
Thank you.
Laura, you had us all deeply moved by your personal story. Do you think a supervised injecting centre might have made any difference in your sister Sky's case?
I do. I told her story before and helped get that centre opened. And people asked me that question while we were campaigning for it. Once upon a time I would have said no, because she was very aware of society. She wouldn't want people to know or see her walking in there. But I have learnt that there was a lot about her that I didn't know. And she was far deeper down the rabbit hole than I ever knew. I do believe now that she would have used it and that it would have helped her. I mean, we know no one has died in there, in any of them around the world. So yes, I think it would have helped her and those who, you know, were using with her. Police officers who were investigating her death told us that there was a lot about Sky we didn't know, and her name was popping up in different places from their records that we had no idea about. So I certainly think she would have used it. And I have since learned, since her passing away, that she actually strongly supported them.
Your professional work means you have an insight into how the story of the Richmond experiment, supposed experiment, such an experiment that they've actually built an entire facility, even though it's only a trial run. I don't know if you've been down there recently, but the problems are not going away. And I wonder if amongst the panel, and I know Fiona's spoken about this often, but sticking with you for the moment, Laura, what do you want to see done in order to improve the experience of our trial in Richmond? Because it's got there's no doubt there's some local resistance, and some of it for good reason. I've been there, I've seen it. I get one of my cars fixed at a mechanic who has had to almost shut down because of the number of people who are injecting in his laneway and coming in and using the taps in the washroom and so on. And life's become intolerable for Danny and Bill, and they're going, what have we done to invite this in?
You asking what I want to see to improve the area around there? Look, I think there needs to be, and I stupidly read all the comments on social media whenever there's a story about the injecting room come up, and you feel the anger and and that's a lot of what I was addressing in my speech. Some people are so angry with what they see in North Richmond, and justifiably so. It is they pay rates to live there, and they're $1 million houses, and there are children that go to school there. But I think we need to be a lot better at coming together as a community on both sides and having a conversation together with those people to take the anger down.
Sure, but what are there practical measures you want to see implemented to try and improve the experience?
I think the injecting centre needs to be bigger. I think there needs to be far more capacity. Certainly, we don't need to shut it down. It needs to be bigger, and there need to be more of them. And I think if there were more of them, then there would be less people in North Richmond going there to use it.
Now, Fiona, this is your mastermind special subject, so off you go.
All right. I think the Supervised Injecting Centre was never going to be a silver bullet. And the reason that people use drugs are multi and many varied. And for that reason, the Supervised Injecting Centre is not necessarily perfect for everyone or even a facility that everyone is going to use. However, I think there are some really immediate things that we can do to assist in the success of it. And one of them, and I can't remember whether Anthony mentioned this, but is providing drugs for the drug user. So we have
the state supplying the drugs.
Yes. So at the moment
You really are ambitious.
I am, but we do it now. We supply methadone, we supply buprenorphine. So why aren't we supplying other drugs? Because methadone and buprenorphine don't help everyone. And for many people who are using heroin, it doesn't help them in not using heroin. So we've got opportunistic traffickers in the area, and they really are. They are trafficking to subsidise their own drug use. So if we were to turn that around and say, let's just do a trial, without building anything new, but 100 of the drug users that are using the centre, we'd say, all right, we will provide you with hydromorphone, which is effectively an analogue of heroin, which has got very much the same effect of heroin. In fact, in studies done in Canada, users could not really tell the difference between heroin and hydromorphone. Give that to 100 of those users, that would drop the trafficking on the street overnight. It would drop the petty crime on the street overnight. It would change the atmosphere and the environment of the area overnight. And if we started that, then we could start looking at rebuilding that community.
All right. Another option, Greg, to making it bigger would be to have more than one for the whole of metropolitan Melbourne. Is it not absurd to ask everyone who wants to use it to come to Richmond?
The heroin injecting room is always a band-aid solution to the drug problem. And the truth is, we're here this evening to talk about, is it time to legalise and regulate, which is what Fiona's talking about there, and putting that agenda clearly on the political debate. And this is not, as mad as it sounds. It's been done in Switzerland and England, various jurisdictions, and the regime is yet to be determined. It's not, as the advocates of prohibition or would say, it's going to be selling drugs at milk bars and supermarkets. No, with narcotics and hard drugs, it would be a regulated market, and that's the best way to think about legalisation, as legal regulation. There's never any thought of not having controls, the mechanisms, as I said in my speech, of alcohol, tobacco. The regulations and controls depends on the nature of the substance. So, look, yes, John, an injecting room is a fantastic thing, but it's by no means a long-term solution. Yes, we should roll them out in every capital city, Geelong and other hotspots, But the truth is, if you're a long-term addict, you should be able to go to a doctor and say, look, I've got a condition here as Laura's sister, and this would have necessarily kept your sister alive, given medical treatment, counselling, and You know, just a quick aside, and I won't go on, but in the 90s when I had my heroin addiction, there was a trial proposed, I think Mick might remember this as well, in Canberra, that was proposed that was going to have legal prescribed heroin as on the table. For long-term addicts, you know, a very medically supervised sort of situation. And it was about to be passed by the AC government when John bloody Howard, and I don't mean to bring it in here, but with his tough on drugs policy, scuttled that. There's more of a backstory on this as well. The backstory is that the International Narcotics Board and we in Australia are beholden to this American-inspired prohibition. The International Narcotics Board came to Australia, threatened our poppy growing fields. We're one of the largest producers of poppies in Australia, and the heroin trial was scuttled. So there were options that were taken off the table, and it is a viable alternative we've got to talk about.
Greg Barnes.
Well, I think Greg's taking the conversation in a direction where it needs to go, but just quickly on heroin injecting facilities, they are simply, if you look around Europe, you see them, they are commonplace, they are in many centres. But just to pick up Greg's point and just to also give people some of Anthony, the flavour of what Anthony was saying, in the last 2 weeks in The Economist, which is a newspaper that I religiously read, and you'd call its politics 19th century liberal. Last week was a major piece on cannabis and the prejudice that lies behind and the antiquated notions that lie behind the way the international, the UN bodies look at cannabis. In the same way that they're in a sense sort of like climate change deniers when it comes to cannabis. The second article, which was a smaller article this week, in Afghanistan, farmers who've got rich out of the heroin game are now moving into a plant which produces pseudoephedrine. And with pseudoephedrine coming off the market, making it harder to get, guess what? This is a bonanza for Afghan farmers. So as the Economist always says, and we should always remember this, there are no wins in the war on drugs, only Pyrrhic victories.
And just before we move to questions, Mick Palmer, on supervised injecting centres, you've had a lot to do with the Sydney one. It's taken Melbourne a very long time, and in the end, in fact, it was Jeff Kennett was one of those who I think was persuaded by a number of people to go and have a look, came back, and apparently if Jeff Kennett says it's okay, that means it's okay. Why are we so slow then to pick up on, I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, why are we so slow to pick up on the obvious lessons from other jurisdictions?
Well, I don't know. But I mean, it took a while in New South Wales, you know, before Bob Carr made the decision to create the medically supervised injecting centre in King's Cross. And they had some of those sort of problems that were touched on before in the near vicinity immediately, but not for long, I have to say. And it has continuing and has continued to have fairly strong police support, maybe not unanimous support, but no signs of obstruction to its process. But what Greg said is to the point that I've been looking at recently, the number of consumption rooms, as they tend to be called, across Europe, you know, even in the most, you know, conservative and autocratic countries like Austria and Germany and Sweden and Switzerland, you know, a whole range of countries that you wouldn't expect to find these in. They're sprouting up all over the place and they're proving their worth, and you're having very senior police come out talking publicly. Well, that's because I pick up Fiona's point about it's nice if we're talking privately, but you hope it's constructive private talk and not destructive private talk, and maybe some of the private talk is not always constructive. In Europe, the support by senior police, and now in the United Kingdom as well, the support by senior police has been quite strong. You know, they're writing, I was reading papers the other day from chief constables of major counties in the United Kingdom talking about the importance of drug reform. That this has failed miserably and we need to find a new way to do business.
All right, Fiona?
Add just quickly to that, and I think Anthony picks it up in his book as well, but when we actually took a bunch of politicians around various countries to look at drug laws and to look at drug law reform, and we created this rather large tome, which I think someone will win tonight. It's a rare one, but
collector's
the police,
item, yep.
Yeah, the Vancouver police took us around to various injecting centres and to show the issues around their opioid crisis. And the police, the head senior police officer, who happened to be retiring that day, said, Fiona, if I could, I would give heroin to every single person who needed it. and instead of the Hells Angels giving it to them. Because I know I could save their lives, and I know I could stop crime in doing that. And yeah, police around the world are coming to that position.
All right, and just Antony, before we get to questions, and there's more people there than we're going to have time to get to, but we'll see how we go. Every time I've ever interviewed anyone about the impact of drugs in the community, I'm reminded that alcohol causes more harm by any measure in our community. And alcohol is sanctioned by the state, taxed by the state, distributed under licence by the state, and generates enormous profits in legal business. And the double standard is right there for us all to see, but we just brush it aside. How do we come to grips with this?
Well, there's a few things on that briefly. One, what's interesting is that the latest studies in Australia, and including in many parts around the world, is that alcohol consumption of the youngest people, often 15 to 24, in fact, is declining, not going up. Older generations do drink more, to be sure. But what should happen, and alcohol companies will resist this, like cigarette companies did, there needs to be warning labels on alcohol. It's so obvious. Alcohol should be legal. I have no problem with alcohol. I drink alcohol myself. But there should be warning labels. Alcohol can, for some people, cause cancer. It's not me saying that. It's various scientific studies that have shown that. In excess, as with a lot of other drugs, that to me would be a given. And I suspect, like with labels on cigarettes, use of alcohol would come down. It's a no-brainer. And alcohol companies would fight it again. Where are the leading politicians? Where's any politician that I know of, correct me if I'm wrong, Fiona, saying that? In the federal parliament.
All right. Now, let's get to our first question here. And just remember, ask a question and not at the whole panel, please.
My question is mostly for Tania, I think, but anyone else who wants to... Laura, but anyone else who wants to take it. And it was... Jon kind of made an offhand comment about 4-year-olds and what we teach them in schools. So my question is, what should we teach kids in schools?
Sorry, for Tania or Laura? Can I clarify?
For Laura.
Laura.
Just thinking about your sister and what you think might have been helpful.
Terrific,
but
thank
anyone
you.
else who wants
Well,
to take it.
it's funny you asked that because I remember something my sister said to me when she was in grade 4, and it was the only time that drugs were addressed, and she said that they, very much like the putting your arm on the person next to you thing, they were all asked to put their hand in the circle and pledge that they would never take drugs. And she told me she did that, but she couldn't believe that her best friend stood back and said, well, I don't know if I'll never take drugs. But I spoke to her about that a few years later, and she said, and since then, she'd never been spoken to throughout primary school or even high school about drugs. So I think as early as later primary school, we should be addressing what the kids in North Richmond are seeing out the front door of their primary school in a compassionate way. I certainly know that just saying drugs are bad and okay does not work. And certainly there needs to be education. I just had 2 children of my own, and I'm so fearful of how to bring them up in terms of the issue of drugs, and they're going to be told very early on about the risks, and it's not going to be a not spoken about issue in our home. The barrier needs to come down. There needs to be education from a very much younger age than what we're seeing now, and education about the risk, of course, the harm, but also education about the people we see on the street who have succumbed and who are using those drugs, and how we need to feel about those people and not judge them and marginalise them.
All right, and thank you, Laura. And Tania, because you were at first asked the question, I'll rephrase it. What should we be teaching kids about drug avoidance, not just drug awareness? In other words, avoiding the stresses and the anxiety and all the other issues, some of which drive people to use drugs.
To avoid them?
Yes.
Well, I don't necessarily think that it's... Well, so just from a bit of background, I always thought that drugs were an absolute no-no, and I was like, I'm a non-drinker. I've never taken any drugs until 3 years ago, and I don't smoke. But I don't think that we should be saying to people that they should avoid drugs because some drugs are extremely beneficial and necessary. And just going back to earlier, what I was saying about the recent trip I had in the US and the UK, I mean, the Johns Hopkins Centre, which Antony referred to, which has just been set up last week with $17 million of philanthropic funding, is not only being used for treatment of major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression and PTSD and all of that, but it's also being set up to help people with dementia, anorexia, and addiction itself. So these drugs are actually being used. When I say these drugs, I'm talking about psilocybin is being used, for example, to help people get off heroin, to get off alcohol addiction and so on, and there's a number of trials going on for that. So I don't think they should necessarily be avoided. I think they just need to be used with care under supervision.
So drug education, literally. Next question, please.
Thank you. My question is for the two panellists with the legal practitioner backgrounds. Do you think that there is an appetite, that's Greg and Mick, is that right? Do you think there's an appetite in Australia to bring litigation, maybe class actions against anyone, public officials, possibly alcohol companies, possibly media who perpetuate stigmatizing attitudes, to bring litigation against those who are actually failing to act when there's so much evidence now that we should?
How entrepreneurial are you feeling? Greg first.
Well, there is an emerging tort in relation to climate change and the failure by governments to act, and in fact some rulings out of US courts and also in Europe. So you couldn't rule it out as a possibility. Australian courts have tended to be, as Jon and I both know, sadly quite conservative in the main, but there is certainly some scope in that field.
Mick, do you want to have a go at it?
Well, I'd have been more negative, I guess, than Greg, and that I'd have thought there probably wasn't much appetite for it in terms of the direct question at the moment. I think Greg's right. I mean, the signs now have changed in the sort of issues that are being considered for class actions and are being launched, and I hadn't stopped to think about that dimension when you asked the question. My immediate response to it would have been, I think we're a fair way short of that yet, and I think we need to, we can't even reach the stage where we can convince governments that the evidence of failure is so dramatic and so clear that we need to have a public debate about what is the best way forward. Even if we can't agree on the sort of things that Antony and Greg have been talking about, that standing still is not an option or should not be an option for us. We're not there yet, so I think an appetite for this is a bit short.
And class action would be fascinating. I mean, to sue people for not doing something is a very difficult thing. Next question, please.
Yeah, hi there. A question for Fiona Patten, and just to say that I've voted for the Australian Sex Party and I've voted for the Reason Party, and I'm a long-term smoker. I've been a cannabis smoker for 25 years. You went to the election, I'm not afraid to admit it either, you went to the election twice now with a policy of legalising cannabis. You went to the election with legalising voluntary assisted dying, which we're all very thankful for. I would have thought that would have been easier than, harder than legalising cannabis. So having gone to two elections and voted for you to legalise cannabis, can we just ask and explain to everyone what the political hold-up actually is?
Thanks. See, not so effective, really.
Yeah, well, come on, Fiona, lift your
losing
game.
on action promises. I think the tide. I think, as Anthony's book is showing, and as we're seeing, the tide is absolutely changing, and law reform, and I think cannabis law reform is inevitable. When you speak to politicians privately, they will agree with me and say that it is inevitable and it will change. I put up a motion to have an inquiry into legalising cannabis, and it was a very broad inquiry. I had these whole points about what the commercial nature of it would look like, the licensing. It was a very fulsome inquiry. Anyway, the government said, well, we can't go with that. Sorry, Fiona, we're not going to agree to that. And I said, all right, why don't we have an inquiry where we ask the question, how do we keep cannabis out of the hands of criminals and children? And kind of to my surprise, the Labor government said, oh yeah, we could have that. So we are going to have, I would say, a very substantial inquiry into how we keep cannabis out of the hands of children and criminals. And that was the exact question that Canada asked when they moved towards legalisation. So I see the world changing. I see New Zealand changing. I see the UK making very loud rumblings. France, maybe even at a federal level in the USA. So I think Australia, it would be great to see us beat New Zealand at something. But I think our community is ready for this, and the Victorian police, I mean, they talk about the billions and billions of dollars that the hot houses around Melbourne provide to organised crime every year. So now is the time to start having this conversation. So thank you, and yeah, anyone who wants to join this conversation and be part of this change, please get involved in that inquiry.
Antony, is there almost a template that's followed wherever these discussions take place around the Western world?
With cannabis, you mean?
Yeah. Is there a series of obvious steps and progressions that pretty much every different jurisdiction goes through?
Well, in the US, where the states have done it successfully, there's often been a lot of failure first. A lot of people often have tried. There's often a vote put, at a federal election. Often it's failed. And there's also been a lot of hard work by activists to A, convince people that cannabis should be legal, B, the massively growing use of cannabis for medicinal purposes has made it seem far more normal drug, that the association of cannabis with, people no hopers, which has been, created by a lot of politicians and media, simply is not true. A lot of people use it for a range of reasons. And I think a lot of people in the US are waking up to that. And I think also a shift is that Obama was the first president during his running for president in 2008 who said, I used cannabis and it's fine. Now, I did inhale, and that was the point. That's what he said, as opposed to Clinton, who denied inhaling. And I mean, Trump, of course, apparently has never used drugs or alcohol, so he's a bit of a different case. But it is far more normal. As I said, a lot of the Democratic candidates in 2020 election next year either talk about they've used pot or they have no problem with people use pot, and they talk about legalising. And so that is a real sea change because they know public support is there.
So effectively, we're back to where we were before. They're not lying anymore, whereas previous politicians, to achieve elected office, you had to pretend.
And the next step, of course, is, I agree, the next step is politicians acknowledging that people also might take cocaine who are not evil, or heroin or other drugs as well.
Yeah, and telling the truth. Next question, please.
I'm from a country area originally, and I like to have considered myself, at least previously, a very law-abiding citizen. And I did not try, despite having access to any sort of marijuana or anything like that, until I went to Amsterdam. And I wanted to, primarily directed at Fiona, know what the plan was to deal with the increased risk of psychosis or things like that for people who do or are more willing to try drugs if they are legalised or decriminalised.
Fiona.
Thanks, and it's a great question, and I think Antony also touched on this. Drug use is not harmless. I would say the prohibition has made it more harmful. It's reduced the ability to educate, but if we looked at particularly something like psychosis, what we've seen in states where cannabis has been legalised, we haven't seen incredible increases in cannabis use. When I know Dr. Alex Wodak quotes this quite often as well, that if you look at a connection between schizophrenia and cannabis, that the number of people who have schizophrenia in our society today, the percentage is about the same as it was 50 years ago, but the use of cannabis has increased in that time. So we would have, I think it's more, we're more able, once we can talk about it, once we take away the stigma, and I think Laura touched on stigma around drug use, and it's such an important part that legalisation, regulation can help us with stigma, it can help us with education, it can help us with regulation. I mean, at the moment, I don't know any drug dealer that probably checks someone's ID before they sell them a bag of dope. Sorry, some exceptions in the room, I'm sure. However, with alcohol, we do check ID, we do educate, and we are actually seeing declines in alcohol use amongst young people because of that education. So I think legalisation will make it safer.
All right, next question, please.
Thank you. The question to Greg Barnes and to Mick Palmer. I'm the current president of the chapter of addiction medicine at the Royal Australasian Royal Australasian College of Physicians, and we're in the process, I'm glad to say, of putting a drug policy document together. This is going to be a revision of Alex's document from about 14 years ago. My question to you is, how do we get your respective professions on side, and how can we engage both with the Police Association and with the lawyers, in whatever guise they come, to actually perhaps use this as an opportunity to get a wider range of support for a document than just a bunch of health professionals who've got a vested interest?
Mick.
I frankly think police associations particularly are open for that discussion. It will vary between the different forces. If we're talking in terms of Victoria here, I think they're open for that discussion. And I would, my approach would be to go and tell them what you're trying to achieve, and you're seeking to get their advice in terms of what they see as the good and bad and ugly in terms of your approach to this particular problem. I mean, there are very few police officers, practitioners, even those that talk publicly about maintaining the status quo, that don't understand and don't accept that what we're doing isn't working. Just that some people, I mean, policing is a pretty busy profession, and so you spend a lot of time on the symptoms and not too much time with the ability to dig down and look at the causes. And that's one of the real weaknesses in policing. It's the nature of the beast for which we pay. So you go out and you arrest the person who commits the crime. You don't ever really spend too much time, unless you need it for your brief, in trying to find out what the real causes were that made this man kill his mum or kill his brother or kill his wife or whatever it is. You're just dealing with the killing. And it's the same in terms of drug policy, that we tend to deal with the symptoms without thinking too much about the causes. One of the big things that impacted on and I know it's impacted on many other police officers' thought processes about this and their views about what is right and wrong with our policy are the personalised stories such as that Laura told, and those that Antony told about Honduras and Guinea-Bissau. Because the reality of our drug policy, sadly, is that it is almost all aimed, apart from organised drug trafficking at the top end, in use and possession terms, it's all aimed at the low-level flying fruit, the low-hanging fruit, the blue-collar workers, the disadvantaged, the mentally ill. I mean, the whole nature of what we do is aimed, not intentionally, but the result of it is that we are impacting on the people who are least able to be impacted upon in that way. And I think there's an appreciation by associations of that. Young men and policemen and women, they need more support amongst the community now than they've ever needed in their history. We really need people in the community to be there in support of police when they hit on hard times and violent times in the street. The last thing they want to do is be put in a situation that has them in conflict with the very young people whose support and assistance they might need.
All right, thank you. Great question. The prospect of a multidisciplinary approach is enticing. Next question, please. We're running out of time.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you. My question is just directed at Greg Barnes. What would happen if we did legalise drugs? What happens to all the people who have currently been incarcerated due to our current policy?
Well, it's a very good question. I think when it comes to possession and use, there ought to be an expunging of their convictions, and as I understand, the law in Canada is moving in that direction, and in the United States. Trafficking is different because it's often associated with violence and other forms of crime. If you legalise drugs, to pick up Fiona's point, it's an important point to make, what you get is quality control. If you look at regulated markets, that's what you get in regulated markets. At the moment, you get no quality control, so it's important to remember that. And the last point I'd make is that it would free the courts up enormously. Drug trials, if they run, generally go for weeks and take up an enormous amount of court time, and we have serious problems with backlogs in our courts. You reduce backlogs substantially if we stop the obsession with, taking people to court for possession and use and small-scale selling.
All righty, thank you. But I don't think there's any talk of retrospectivity, is there? Of saying, oh, well, hang on, for the last 50 years, we're gonna.
There is in relation to possession and use in Canada, so people will now have their convictions expunged.
So you'd be able to say, I don't have a criminal record even if you were convicted years ago.
That's right.
All right, thank you for that. Next question, we're running out of time.
Yeah, g'day. My name is Greg Kasarik. I'm a functional and proud drug user. Now, I use LSD, magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, mescaline for religious and spiritual purposes. It took me a few years, but I got myself successfully arrested in 2016. Faced two magistrates, both of who recognised that my use is religious. The second magistrate actually agreed, under the Victorian Charter of Human Rights Responsibilities Act, that the government does not have a demonstrably justifiable reason for prohibition for religious purposes. Now, my question is, basically what the magistrate said was to me, I'm not going to refer you to the Supreme Court because you're not important enough. It was just me. All of my supporters were at work. They couldn't take an entire day off to attend court. So my question to Greg, Chipp and Fiona Patten, you've got a room full of early adopters. You've got several hundred people here. How do we turn what we have here, the people we have here, into a movement so that people like myself, when we do face court, aren't told that we are not important enough?
Okay, thank you for your question, which I'm going to take as a Tony Jones-style comment from the floor rather than a question, particularly because you put it to three people, and I'm going to invite the next question, and we'll take that one as an interesting contribution to the evening's proceedings. Please.
Hello. I think it's interesting to note that we haven't talked a lot about pop culture's reference to drugs, which is mostly celebratory, which is an interesting double standard with our public stance, or institutional stance, you might say. But anyway, Mick, my question is, during your tenure, what was the proportion of the police budget that was actually devoted to or contributed, or that the police used to actually enforce drug policy?
All right, thank you. Mick, any idea?
I frankly don't really know, and I'll tell you why. Certainly in my Northern Territory days in community policing, there was no budget set aside specifically for drug investigation or drug culture. In the Australian Federal Police environment, that was different. I went to the AFP in 1994. John Howard was elected in 1996, and in 1998 he created the Tough on Drugs policy. So I was the commissioner of the AFP when the Tough on Drugs policy came in. And there was, I just can't remember the figures, I'm sorry, but there was very significant money given to the Australian Federal Police for the creation of what we called strike teams to investigate and, if you like, attack organised production, but particularly organised trafficking, international trafficking of drugs. But there was also significant money given by Howard, in fairness to him, for diversion and treatment and the creation of drug courts and so on, and I was involved in both sides of those equations. There was, I think it was 60-something% of the overall Tough on Drugs policy, in fact, went to diversion and treatment, to the demand reduction side of the equation, rather than the supply reduction.
Okay.
So it was quite significant, but the money was significant, and we dined out on the strike teams. I mean, they made very good front-page news in newspapers and so on in terms of seizures and so on.
As they always do, and as Antony remarks in his book, you get these record haul front pages, and of course then a month later there's another record haul, and they just keep on going and no one goes, hang on, what's going on here? Now, another question. And I'm not sure if the woman in the T-shirt is just keeping up the end of the queue, or no, you've got a question. Okay, let's get through them fairly quickly because we're out of time.
Fiona, I'm a country Victorian. I've been using cannabis for a long time, but medically for the last 5 years. I'm facing my 4th loss of licence, not for driving under the influence, or not for driving while affected, for having it detectable in my system. I live in the country. I live in a very isolated area of the country. We've got no public transport. When can we expect some sort of fairness in this? I was close to poverty 2 months ago and living under a bridge, and the police laugh at me. I've got approval from the Therapeutics Goods Administration. They laugh at me and tell me, mate, we only got to have it in your system to take your licence off you. They think it's a bloody joke.
Fiona.
Thank you for raising that. And look, if I was to be very generous, I would say that this was an oversight of our medicinal cannabis legislation. However, I don't really believe that. I am actually first reading a bill in tomorrow to amend the Road Safety Act to include prescribed medicinal cannabis in the exemptions of all prescription medications. So that doesn't mean you can drive impaired, as you say, but if you have a prescription for a medication, you should be allowed to drive as well, as long as you are not impaired. And at the moment, because we have a zero tolerance to the mere presence of THC in a system, that is very difficult. I think there is starting to be some sympathy to this, and we've certainly heard it from doctors and practitioners where they've had, mothers wanting to get off benzodiazepines and have found some relief in a high CBD, low THC product that they would take of an evening, but are too scared to take their kids to school in the morning for fear that they may be tested. So it is happening, and I think, I am certainly trying my hardest. We saw an interesting court case in northern New South Wales, which Greg might know more about, where the judge just said this was ridiculous, and he gave a no conviction, recorded no loss of licence to a cannabis user.
There's been some discussion in the Fiona in terms of, and Greg would know, I think, in terms of reintroducing impairment testing.
That's right. Yeah.
Instead of just being a
An
zero.
automatic, a mandatory penalty.
Bad luck at staging your system for 3 weeks,
That's right.
In fact, Tony Parsons has been talking about this, one of the
Tony
magistrates.
Parsons from the drug court, the magistrate in the drug court. And there's now so many people who are self-medicating, in particular for things like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, all sorts of other conditions where clearly it's of some help. And
there was this most wicked story about a fellow in a regional area who had epilepsy, and cannabis was assisting him in the epilepsy to the point that he had been without a seizure for 6 months, which would qualify him to apply for his licence. But because it was medicinal cannabis that enabled him to get to that point, he couldn't apply for his licence.
Catch-22, and the Premier was so moved by that little boy's plight that in fact he was prepared. I mean, sometimes individual cases do have an impact.
That's
it just
right.
needs the right one to be a test case. Last question, and then we have a treat in store for you.
My question is for Laura. Firstly, I'm just very deeply sorry about the loss of your loved sister. I hear that she was very loved. My question is around stigma. You stand before us and tell us that it was heroin that ultimately killed Skye. However, I think it was the stigma also that drove Skye to that fateful night. How do we go about, we all talk about drug legislation, and how do we go about breaking down this stigma, coming together as a community to break down this stigma? I mean, you told your story on A Current Affair, which I sadly watched 18 months after I lost my own son, and we're no closer to breaking down. We've got no further to breaking down this stigma. So how are we going to do that as a community? Because we can't do it alone. Telling stories on International Overdose Awareness Day, we need to tell them every single day.
Well, I think we are further. I think once upon a time my sister's story would not have made it onto A Current Affair. I'm lucky that I had a supportive boss who allowed me to put that story to air. But the thing that I was surprised by, that when that story went to air, the phones ran off the hook. The feedback was enormous. I was in the corner drinking red wine and trying to ignore it, but it was enormous. And I was surprised because a lot of the feedback was positive. So online, there was, as I retold, hatred and abuse and people contacting me, but there was a hell of a lot more people than I expected who supported it and called in and wrote me letters and were so supportive and thankful to me for telling their story. So we need more of this. We need, and I had meetings with people in Spring Street who are right up there, who privately said to me, you shook Parliament with that story. We need, sadly, the people who feel the most fragile, which is people like me, to be the most bold and shout it from the rooftops. It's my son, it's my daughter, it's my niece, it's my nephew, so that we drown out the other voices of hatred and judgment, because at the moment they can be the loudest, and that makes the rest of us shrivel and feel, I'm being judged. But if we can talk, get it out there, so that it's deafening, we will prevail.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Ladies and gentlemen, while you're clapping, could you please thank Antony, Greg, Mick, Fiona, Greg, Laura and Tania.